Welcome to another presentation from the House of David Fellowship in Richmond, Virginia. I'm Lee Miller. Today we're going to pick up where we left off at our last meeting. We got out of Acts 15. Yes, I know that took 6 months, but you know, that's how it goes. So we got out of Acts 15 and we got all the way through to 16:3. Today we're going to pick up 16:4. Of course, we will do a slight review, so let me go ahead and get started with that. All right, here's what we're going to be covering today. Obviously, we'll start with a quick review from the last meeting, just touch on the journal article that we referenced. Today, one of our focus is going to be Dr. Bruce Chilton, who is a Protestant Christian theologian of renown, and that's one of the reasons why I'm glad that he was chosen. We'll be quoting him. I have his book here. I'll be showing that to you later. And the section that we'll be quoting from his book is going to be Galatians 4, 8 through 11. And I have some quotes on the screen, so you'll be able to see those. And then after he makes his case, he has an admission on page 195. We'll get to that. Then we're going to talk about Julius Caesar's executive order. If you've been following the political landscape of the last administration and the current administration, you know what an executive order is, and you know the problems of an executive order. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to specifically look at Julius Caesar's executive order for June in 47 BC. Then we're going to talk about the implications thereof of what that means. And then finally, we'll get on into Acts 16:4. So let's go ahead and start with our review from our last meeting. We were looking at a journal. It's called the Journal of New Testament Studies. It's number 42 from 1996, and I quoted a couple of pages. It's written by Dr. Troy Martin, and we're going to see him referred to a couple of times, so I'm just letting you know that that's coming. Here is the title, and I'm putting it up in bits because I want you to follow his title as to what we're going to be covering today. All right, pagan and Judeo-Christian. So think about Dr. Martin, Protestant Christian theologian. He has divided up a couple of texts that he's going to look at, and it's like labeling the argument. That's how I would phrase it. He probably would say it differently, but in the way that he labels his argument, he's got pagan and Judeo-Christian. Timekeeping schemes, let's reduce that down to English. Calendars. Talking about calendars. In Galatians 4:10, and Judeo-Christian in Colossians 2:16. All right, so here's the full title. Pagan and Judeo-Christian timekeeping schemes in Galatians 4:10 and Colossians 2:16. And he's taking up an opposing position, as I like to do frequently when I'm in a discussion, and I have a different perspective on how I see that particular text being discussed. I'll raise my hand and say, I have an opposing opinion. And so Dr. Martin has submitted an opposing position, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the presentation. The key thing that we need to keep in mind that we discussed in the last meeting, there are three choices that are presented to believers in Yeshua. We call it Yeshuic Judaism. Three choices that are available from the perspective of a calendar. It's either you follow a pagan calendar, you follow the biblical calendar, or you don't follow a calendar. Pagan, biblical, none. This is how he sums up his argument in his journal article. Okay, so next what we want to do, I want to remind you of a study that we did when we were dealing with Cornelius in Acts 10. Now, if you remember, a lot of people refer to that story more from the standpoint of Peter, because Peter is definitely, I don't want to take anything away from Peter, he is a major player in the story. But what I want to do, and we did this, and this is the slide from the presentation that we did 2 years ago, I'm going to point out some things about Cornelius that I want you to just have in mind as we walk through the unfolding events of the book of Acts. He was devout. This is directly out of the text, by the way. I'm not just making up these bullet points. I have pulled these out of the text in Acts 10. Devout and just God-fearer. There was a good report about him among all the nation of the Jews. He reverenced God with all his house. He gave generously to the needs of the Jews, and I might just remark, not that I'm speaking specifically of him, but archaeology has shown us that there have been at synagogues that they have dug out in the early centuries, there will be some type of post or something like a post in which the names of Gentile contributors to the community and the synagogue are listed, where they are being recognized for providing financial assistance to the need of the people. So, I'm not saying that they found one with Cornelius' name on it, but I'm just saying, archaeologically speaking, this is a well-established fact that Gentiles contributed to what was going on with the Jewish nation. And so the text in Acts 10 brings that out here. The text also says that he fasted and prayed often. Praying at the 9th hour, he received a vision. Now we're actually in the story that takes place that includes Peter. He's praying at the 9th hour. Peter's not involved yet. Cornelius receives a vision. What is the 9th hour? The 9th hour is a Jewish time reference because they prayed at the 9th hour. So here is a non-Jew praying at the 9th hour. Something to take note of. When Peter arrives, they honor Peter in, like they bow down and pay homage type thing. So, and he worshipped in the synagogue, but he was not circumcised. So that means there are limitations. If you're not circumcised, then you're not a proselyte. You also have not spoken an oath that says that you will observe all of the traditions of the fathers as though they were the written Torah. You haven't made that oath, so that's missing from your life. You can't go and do certain things in the temple. Of course, we're not talking about temple service, we're talking about synagogue service, but I'm just saying that if you are attaching yourself to the Jewish nation, then there is some things that you're limited to do when it comes time to do sacrifices and some other stuff if you're not circumcised. Okay, so I'm just saying that we're more focused on the synagogue today, and as you go through the book of Acts, I don't have to tell you how many times they mention, and somebody went into the synagogue. What you won't see is somebody went into the temple to talk to the God-fearers and the Jews. You won't see that, because it's not in the text. But multiple times you will see that people went in to the synagogue and they did whatever it was they did. So that's just out of the text, not telling you anything that you won't see when you read the text. All right, so let's go ahead and get into Galatians 4. I want to look at this because if we're going to be talking about the quotes from this particular professor about this text, then it behooves us to read the text up front just to remind ourselves about what it's talking about. So let's take a look. Verse 8. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to beings that by nature are not gods at all. But now that you've come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again? And I've got that highlighted in yellow because I looked at the Greek to make sure it was there, because I was like, this is odd. This is very odd. I wasn't expecting turn back again, because it's kind of like a situation of, so when are you going back to the Grand Canyon? Well, you can't say that because I've never been. So it's not like I'm going back to a place I've been to before. I've never been. So the correct text would be, when are you going to the Grand Canyon? Not when are you returning to the Grand Canyon. So I was like, well, this could be one of those situations where the English does not really provide us with the best translation. I've seen it before, you've seen it before. And we have to pick through the text every now and then, but that's not the case here. The Greek is very clear, and it says return. So, I'm looking at this. We got this part in 8. Enslaved to beings that you thought were gods, but they're not. So that's what you're coming out of. Now you know God. Well, really, God knows you. That means God called you. Okay? How can you go back to that? It's kind of what the text is saying. So let's go ahead and finish verse 9. How can you turn back again to the weak and worthless basic forces? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? So now, Paul is writing some type of concern here. Turn back to the weak and worthless basic forces. So I believe that phrase is referring back to 8. All right, let's go on to verse 10. You are observing religious days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. This is Paul talking to the Gentile believers in Galatia. All right, so, verse 10. What is it talking about? I've looked at the text. We could explore the text more, and as I said, we already did explore this text 6 years ago when we broke down this entire thing on April the 2nd, 2011. It's in the archives, published in a public forum. Okay, so we've already done that work. What we're doing now is looking at a more specific, we're drilling down to something more specific because we want to, let's say, want to take a look at the arguments surrounding what's going on here. So that's why I'm taking this approach. This is not really a study of Galatians 4 as much as it is an observation as to how it's understood so that we can think for ourselves, which we do. All right? So where are we going to start? The first place we're going to start is with a gentleman who is a writer and correspondent for the Jerusalem Report. Now some of you may not be familiar with that magazine, Jerusalem Report. It is a subsidiary of the Jerusalem Post, which many more of you may be familiar with. I read the Jerusalem Post to get my international news. This particular gentleman is a writer and correspondent, and if you look to the right of his name on the screen, you'll see that it looks like a red line. That's a link to his website, in case you want to pursue this further. Once this PowerPoint presentation is uploaded on the website, converted as a PDF, so this becomes a live link. Okay, it's not there now, but it will be there in this week coming up. So if you wanted to pursue that, the link is there, and you'd be able to check it out. He wrote an article. It was called The Man Who De-Judaized Jesus, and this was written back March 7th, 2005. So in reading this article, and we're going to talk about first impression of the title of his article, and then we're going to move on because it's almost like a tangent. But I just want to make sure you're with me here. The man, so we're talking about a man who de-Judaized Jesus. So the author's position is that Yeshua was not doing something that would remove himself from Judaism. But there was somebody who came after him who did exactly that. And that's what the article is about. And in the article, he's reviewing a book by Dr. Bruce Chilton. It's called Rabbi Paul, an Intellectual Biography. Here's what the book cover looks like. The library doesn't have the book cover, so, you know. But anyway, this is what the book cover looks like. So let's talk about this particular Protestant Christian scholar. Who is Dr. Bruce Chilton? He is a scholar of early Christianity and Judaism. This is where he focused. This is his focus of his work. He has a PhD in New Testament from Cambridge, which is pretty honorable. He's done a lot of writing. Here is a list of just some of his works. Each one of those are a link so that you would be able to pull the ISBN number in case you wanted to pursue that further. I put it there because that's what I do. He's got some really interesting titles here. the pure kingdom, Jesus' vision of God, redeeming time, the wisdom of ancient Jewish and Christian festal calendars, Judaism in the New Testament, the brother of Jesus, James the Just. He's got some books here. This guy is like, kind of up there. He even created his own journal. So, just saying. All right, so let's get into the text and let's take a look at what the doctor is going to tell us about Galatians 4. The first quote starts at page 187, which is where I have the mark in the book, if you decide you want to look at this. Here is his quote. Paul was incensed because the non-Jewish believers, who are the non-Jewish believers? They're believers that aren't Jewish. Okay? Non-Jewish believers were now willing to keep the calendar of Judaism and accept the strictures of James about what they could eat. All right, so opening quote here that I have chosen is that his understanding of what you just saw in the text of Galatians 4, 8 through 11, as he understands what Paul is saying, Paul is incensed that the Jews, these non-Jewish believers in Yeshua, that would be Gentiles, I guess, are now willing to keep the calendar of Judaism. Let's continue. Keeping the this is what he says, Paul is saying in the next verse. Keeping the festivals and Sabbaths of Judaism is as bad as serving idols. This is how he's reading verse 10. Galatians 4, verse 10. If after you have accepted Yeshua as the appointed Messiah of Israel, after that has taken place, if you continue to keep the festivals and the Sabbaths of Judaism, you have become an idol worshiper, is what he understands Paul to be saying. I thought that was interesting. He blasted any gesture by Gentile Christians toward an acceptance of Judaism. He said that the Torah itself had become an obstacle to the message of Christ. Paul's logic is only convincing. He writes this. Paul's logic is only convincing if you accept his axiom that the Torah and the Spirit of God are at odds. Now, when I was researching these quotes, because I was reading the book, and I'm like, do I really want to go down this path? Because I could go down this path. We could go to Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, and some other places, and we could talk about the relationship within the New Covenant of the Spirit of God and the Torah, because they're all mentioned together. I chose not to. But we could have explored that. But listen, I'm here to give Dr. Chilton his voice. He has something to say. I'm going to listen. All right, so this particular quote is Paul's logic about once you've heard the message that Yeshua is the Messiah, once you've heard it, the day you have heard it, if you go to synagogue on the next Sabbath, you are an idol worshiper. Now, he says, Paul's logic is only convincing if you accept his axiom that the Torah and the Spirit of God are at odds. I don't personally accept that, but I'm just saying, let's continue to hear what the doctor has to say. Paul called them stupid. Yes, he did. Referring to their ancient ancestral religion as silly idolatry. Wow. Now, let's think back. Let's think back to Cornelius. Gentile, God-fearer, financial contributor to the Jews, to their needs, to probably the synagogue, whatever. That didn't say, but there's some different things that he could have been a financial contributor. It just said he was that. Prayer at 9, that's kind of interesting. He's got all this stuff working. He's been going to the synagogue and he's been hearing what's been going on. He hasn't committed to circumcision, but he's involved in the community to some degree, maybe to the maximum community. A Gentile can be involved, I don't know, text doesn't say, but he's involved. And then on the day, now here's the thing. According to what the doctor is saying, Peter goes to his house, gives his message. Okay, he accepts the message that Yeshua is the Messiah. From that point on, if he goes back to the synagogue, he's an idol worshiper. Really? Man, I have to tell you, this took me by surprise. Took me by surprise. Okay, continuing. To be Israel, the doctor says, you needed no law, no calendar. Since God has changed the whole definition of what it means to be His chosen. Is that the same God that says, I change not? A little confusing there, but try to give the man the benefit of the doubt. It's a question in my mind. I mean, I can show you a text where it says, I change not. So, and we always can fall back on the Amos 3 text, which says, I don't do anything except I tell the prophets first. What do you do with that? If it's not in the prophets, explain how you got to that conclusion. He doesn't mention anything about Amos 3. I don't know. I'm sure as a scholar he's aware of it, but I'm just saying these are questions that arose within me when I was confronted with these quotes. Continuing. Here is the confession. More than a century after Paul, he is writing this, it's in his book. More than a century after Paul, there is excellent evidence that the Galatians were in fact keeping the calendar of Judaism and observing regulations of food purity. He admits that even with the abusive Paul in Galatians, calling the people stupid, and whatever other names he called, I don't even want to explore that subject. After that, and he tells them, look, you're going to be lost. You go back to the synagogue the next Sabbath, you're an idol worshiper, you're out of here. That's what he's teaching, according to how the doctor understands it. So here the doctor admits, when you look at the evidence, which we're going to, after we finish Acts 28, we've got a ways to go. We're in 16, we've got to go to 28. But after we get there, then we're going to pick up the rest of what happened in the first century, which is, of course, outside the canon, and what happened in the second century that's also outside the canon. But these are not writings that are apocryphal or pseudepigraphical. These are writings that came out of Rome, writings that came out of the Jews, writings that came from rabbis that were bishops and assemblies the apostles had put in. We're going to look at all of those to see what actually happened and line that up with the text. But the doctor has already been there and done that. He's done with that, and his conclusion is, excellent evidence exists that they continue to keep the calendar of Judaism, which is my focus right now in this, and observing regulation of food period. I'm not going to get into that. Okay, but do you hear that? It's like, well, doctor, have you considered maybe that your conclusion is wrong? Nah, I'm not going to talk to this dude. Okay, but that's what came up within me. That's what arose within me. All right, let's continue. I had to ask this question. From his own personal testimony in his book, the Galatians weren't buying what he says Paul was selling. Because if they were, they'd have stopped going to the synagogue and the temple. And they didn't. And they would have stopped observing the biblical food laws, and they didn't. Well, looks like to me they weren't buying it, according to how the doctor shares it. 2. The author has misunderstood what exactly Paul was selling. I'm giving this as an option. Is it possible the doctor has misunderstood what Paul was putting forth in that section of text? I'm just putting it out there. That's all I'm saying. It's reasonable for us to ask that question. Remember, our choices concerning the calendar are pagan, biblical, and none. Notwithstanding the evidence he mentioned, let's explore the option of none. Order. How many people have seen it? We're going to talk about Law and Order. We're going to talk about Julius Caesar's executive order that was written in June of 47 BC. And if any question shall arise concerning the Jews' manner of life, it is my pleasure that the decision shall rest with them, that is, the Jews. Document 1, Section 2, pages 28 through 30, seems to imply the permission to live according to Jewish law, namely, according to the rules of the Torah. Isn't that interesting? It's from the book Jewish Rights in the Roman World by Miriam Zeev. If you look at the screen there, you'll see it looks like there's a red line underneath Jewish Rights in the Roman World. That's not a red line, that's the link, which I put so that you can access this work online. So when this becomes a PDF, that link will be active and you can go check this out. Here is the piece on it. This is a writing that talks about what's in the book, what she saw. She seems to be the key scholar who has done the research of taking all of the Roman laws referenced in Josephus, who's another first century historian, that lines up how the Jews were treated as to be compared with all other nations under Roman rule. Now, I'm going to give you an analogy of what that would look like today. I don't know what you want to call us, but we're going to just use the term Yeshuic Judaism, which we've used here for many years. All right, so we're going to call what we do and what other assemblies like us do Yeshuic Judaism. So this would be the analogy. The federal government comes to us one day and says, okay, look guys, you don't have to pay taxes anymore. You don't have to do this, and you don't have to do this, and you don't have to do this. It is fine. Now we'd be sitting back and go, okay, that's cool. How would the rest of the nation of the United States, talking about different religious factions, how would they feel about that? I bet you some people would protest. Why are you singling out these people and giving them all these wonderful things and not the rest of us? And they would have an argument. But here's the problem. In the first century, you didn't really argue with Rome. If Rome issued an edict, you did it. That's how it works. And here is what was issued. If you are a part of the Jewish party, that's not the best way to call them. Maybe we should use Jewish nation. But however you want to phrase it, if you are a part of that, then you don't have to worship the emperor, and you do not have to bring the offerings that are required of all other citizens and non-citizens of the kingdom to the emperor. And you don't have to do this, and you don't have to do that. Okay, so as long as you are a part of the Jewish community family, you are exempt from all these laws. And there's a boatload that are mentioned in Josephus that Miriam Zeev points out in her work, and that's why I've put this here in case somebody wants to pursue this further. All right, so privilege given to the Jews only and upheld for the most part of his successors. Now, I want to tell you about what that means. To the best of my knowledge, only Jews got the exemption to not have to worship the emperor, which was really cool. Now, as I said early on, executive orders are not like legislation. If, in our particular nation, if the Senate and the House write up some legislation and they vote on it in a full vote, and then it goes to the president signs it, then it becomes law until somebody challenges it and goes to the courts, and then it works its way through the court until it gets to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court rules on it and says this is valid, you're done. This is the law of the land. And until you can get back to another Supreme Court that'd be even willing to look at it, and they don't do that much, if they've already made a ruling, they're going to sit on that ruling most of the time. So when you get it that far, this is good to go. Executive orders, not so much. They barely have the force of law. So what we found when I was looking at this and going through all of these writings was that from emperor to emperor, there would be these slight changes. But what I found was a consistent line in which the Jews were given this privilege all the way through, with just a few burps here and there, a few hiccups here and there. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is good. I'm going to keep this in mind, and you will see why I'm making such a big deal about this. Remember, we think, and it has been submitted to us by scholars that are above my pay grade, that there are three choices in calendar system: pagan, biblical, and none. Concerning non-biblical, I'm going to package this up a little bit different to make my point. In practical terms, anyone not associated directly with the Jewish religion was obliged to observe the local and imperial calendar in matters such as family and civil cult. Now, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to say that you have to if you're not of the Jewish community family, you have to follow this. So you know what that does? It eliminates none. None does not exist. And scholars don't take that into consideration, because if you decide, you know what, I'm not going to be a part of the Jewish community anymore, I'm just going to go do my thing. Well, guess what? You're either going to be sold into slavery or you're going to be dead. Because you have to observe worshiping the emperor as God, or be in the Jewish community family, or be a slave or dead. Those are your options. So if the believers in Acts, that chapter after chapter, and Paul and Barnabas and Silas and somebody else went into the synagogue and they did this, and some of the Gentiles believed, and some of the women who were well known in the city believed, if you went to synagogue the next service, you're a pagan. You're an idolater. Really? How come there's no text that says that? I've read through Acts more than once, and I have never seen in the book of Acts by the narrator a mention of the fact that once you come to a knowledge of Yeshua as being the appointed one, the next time you step foot into the synagogue, you are now officially an idol worshiper. It's lacking in the text. The only place it shows up is in the interpretation of Galatians 4:10. That's the only place it shows up. Now, you're sitting there and you're going, okay, I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. You found this guy that was so far out on the edge that he's not even on the radar. And he's making this case that nobody else subscribes to. And while you're telling me the truth, he does say that, and that can be confirmed, how do I know that he's not just a Fruit Loop? I said to myself, self, what if they ask me that question? What's going to be the answer? And I said, oh, really? You think that? Well, let's take a look at the leading commentaries, the leading scholars, and then a few others on the side just for a garnish. Anchor Bible Commentary, International Critical Commentary, the New International Commentary in the New Testament, Smith and Helway, Word Biblical Commentary, Galatians by Dr. Dunn, Dr. Bruce, Dr. Fung, Baker Exegetical, Concordia Commentary, the New International Greek Testament Commentary. I read them all. They all agree with Dr. Chilton. But not only that, knowing how critical thinking and reading you guys are, I took every one of these sections and created a PDF of every one of them and posted it online so you could go read every one of these commentaries if you think that I am skewing the poll. You will find out that's not the case. So, having said that, Let's get into Acts. 4:12. I'm not reading this verse by verse. I'm reading the things that are of interest to what we're doing, which is understanding the events that took place, certain key Greek words and phrases that are not well represented in the English, things of that nature. And we're going to be conscious of not just Dr. Chilton, but all of the major scholars and Christian commentaries in the world today that all subscribe to what I just read you, which is the next day you step into a synagogue meeting, you are an idol worshiper. We're going to consider that as we read through Acts. That might be a new thought to consider. Maybe you didn't think about that in the past when you read through Acts. All right. As they traveled through cities, they delivered the decree. What decree was that? That's the decree in Acts 15. Now here's something that's really interesting too. Is this a contradiction? Is this ironic? Is this confusing? I don't know. But what did we just learn from James, Jacob, Yaakov, in the book of Acts, chapter 15, when the four are given? What does he say? He says, blah, 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 and blah. And then he says, because, and remember, we looked at the Greek word gar, G-A-R, and we went through and looked at all of the occurrences of gar in the New Testament to determine its usage in a conjunction form in syntax of the Greek language to understand what James is saying as the narrator writes this out. James is saying, I'm only giving you these four because, and then he says the strangest thing. He says, because the Torah of Moses is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. But if you can't go because that makes you an idol worshiper, what was James thinking? Wow. Listen, I'm reporting what I'm finding. Do with it as you see fit. All right, so, verse 4, they traveled through cities, delivered the decree from James. So the ecclesia was strengthened in the faith. 6 through 12, they continued their travels through different cities, eventually ending up in Philippi, a Roman colony. Lots of things to be discussed here. I looked at archaeology, a lot of stuff there, really interesting stuff. We haven't got no time for that at all. Just don't have the time. But it was a fascinating read. 13, on the Sabbath day, we went outside the city gate to the side of the river where we thought there would be a place of prayer, and we sat down and began to speak to the women who had assembled there. Now, in a smaller point size, I wrote no synagogue. So I started to do some research, and you've probably heard this. I don't know if this still applies today, but there was a time when this applied, and that is, you have to have 10 Jews to create a synagogue. Whatever that's called, it's some official thing. You've got to have 10 Jewish men to create a synagogue. And so I started to look into that to find a little bit more about it in the first century. And it appears that what cities did prior to a synagogue being established is they established a river where the Jews could go to pray because they didn't have a synagogue. And I was like, now ain't that just cool? Because here's a text in which it says, there's no synagogue, let's go down to the river. And it was like, I wonder why they did that. They did it because the cities accommodated the Jewish people prior to the establishment of the synagogue. How cool is that? I was like, I like this stuff. Okay, 14, a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city, a God-fearing woman, listened to us. The Lord opened her heart to respond what Paul was saying. When she and the members of her household were baptized, which kind of reminds me of the Cornelius story. If you remember, Peter came, he spoke to Cornelius, but there were other family members that were gathered for that meeting. So he's talking, and then you get this a lot. Households get baptized. The entrance into the covenant. Pretty cool. Anyway, verse 15, when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. She said, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. Hospitality was already happening, and she persuaded us. Okay. In verse 16, now as we were going to a place of prayer, a slave girl met us who had a spirit that enabled her to foretell the future by supernatural means. I did research this also. This was kind of interesting, the history behind it, the particular spirit god, how it was used. It was actually something that a lot of people had jobs doing. Just interesting. She brought her owners a great profit by fortune telling. She followed behind Paul and us and kept crying out, these men are servants of the Most High God who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. That sounds like a good message to me. What's the problem? 18, she continued to do this for many days. But Paul became annoyed. The man needs more grace. Paul became annoyed and turned and said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Messiah Yeshua to come out of her, and it came out of her instantly. And then it begins. Have you ever heard anybody say something about there are consequences for your actions? Well, let's see what consequences Paul got to experience. But when her owners saw their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. Now, the first time you read this in the KJV, you figure marketplace, you figure, well, they dragged them into Kroger or Walmart. Why would they do that? But that's really not an accurate rendering. It's really they dragged them into the courts of justice hall. Just most English translations don't give you that, but that's okay. So, I'm going to say, and this was another problem I had with Yeshua. I haven't ever really resolved this, but you remember there was a story when he was talking about how there were some pigs, and he did something to cause the pigs to run like over a cliff or something?
Yes.
Killed all the pigs? Yeah, I was wondering, I said, how can you go destroy some man's livelihood by just removing a demonic spirit? I mean, aren't you like culpable now? Don't you need to return like 1.2% or whatever the number is? But the text doesn't say anything about that, so I haven't worked through that yet. But anyway, here's something very similar. These guys have a job. Their job is to make money because this woman forecasts the future. And they make a lot of money. And Paul just took that away. They're not happy. Are we surprised? So, when her owners saw their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the courts of justice hall before the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews, okay, and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs which are not lawful for us to receive or practice, being Romans. I wonder if they were talking about Yeshua is going to be king of the whole earth. You know, that dictatorship that's coming up at the next age? So I was like, well, is there some Roman law about this? There is. There's an actual Roman law, I think it was by Tiberius, I have the reference at home, in which they made the statement that you can never talk about the demise of an emperor who's alive. You can't talk about that, the demise of the emperor. And so, if Paul was talking about the day is coming when Yeshua will be the supreme dictator of the whole earth, well, that would violate the law. So that's a problem. So they're bringing him in. Romans can't believe that, because then those Romans are going to be in a major problem. All right, let's continue reading. 22, 23, the crowd joined the attack against them. Now it gets ugly. Magistrates tore their clothes off and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had beaten them severely, they threw them into prison and commanded the jailer to guard them securely. Now, here's my opinion on the matter. The mistake here is they were imprisoned without due process. See, even in Rome in the first century, there was a judicial way to handle problems. It's in the law. I've read it. You're going to see how this plays out. These guys didn't do it. They messed up severely. You're going to see how that goes too. God set them free. You remember that. They're singing at midnight. And you know, there was a apocalypse of Joseph? I think it's the apocalypse of Joseph. Not sure. This is a pseudepigraphical work in the intertestamental literature between the close of the Old Testament canon and the beginning of the New Testament. There's a writing in which when Joseph was jailed, they made note that at midnight he was singing praises to God. It's in the writing. I went and looked it up. And so we've got the same thing going on here. Paul knows his history. He's singing at midnight. So anyway, God sets them free. Okay. But, so they're free to go. They're free to go. God has opened whatever they were, classed up with. I don't know exactly what that was. But whatever they were classed up with, they're set free. Doors are open. What does Paul decide we're going to do? No, we're not leaving. We're going to get our pound of flesh, Paul said. Let's take a look. Oh, I didn't even put it in there. Okay, well anyway, in the text, they send a message back that says, let the people go. Paul says, not happening. We are Roman citizens. You cannot flog us without due process. You violated the law. You bring those magistrates down here and have them apologize. So then when the magistrates get informed, we just flogged Roman citizens with no due process. We're in a heap of trouble. Paul got his pound of flesh. Then he left and went to Lydia's house. So there's your story. Paul the Apostle, the man of grace and love. Just saying. 17. After they traveled through that city and that city, they came to that city, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Paul went to the Jews in the synagogue as he customarily did. And on 3 Sabbath days, he dialegomai. How many people remember that Greek word from last week? This is dialegomai. That's the Greek word that's in the text there. So, let's read it with the Greek. And on 3 Sabbath days, he dialegomai them from the Scriptures. Let's review. Here's our Greek word. Of a reasoned discussion. Discourse with, conduct a discussion, speaking to someone in order to reason with them, the presenting of arguments using Scripture as a basis, or the engaging in dialogue and debate over the meaning of scriptural texts, appealing to them as people of intelligence who could discern the truth if the case was laid out before them in good logical fashion. This is the definition of dialegomai. And it shows up in our Greek text right here. So let's reread the verse with the Greek word. Paul went to the Jews in the synagogue, as he customarily did, and on 3 Sabbath days, he appealed to them as people of intelligence who could discern the truth about Yeshua's messiahship if the case was laid out before them in good logical fashion from the Scriptures. I like that. I like when people have a voice and they have a platform to be able to speak. It's not that what they're saying is necessarily right. It's that they have the platform to speak. They're not being shut down, and they're given the opportunity to make a case. I like it. Verse 3, Paul explained and demonstrated that the Messiah had to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, "This Yeshua I am proclaiming to you as the Messiah." 4, some of them were persuaded to join Paul and Silas along with a large group of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Little did they know that this is their last day in the synagogue for the rest of their life. Because if they show up at the next meeting, they are officially idol worshipers. Really? I did not know this. I tell the truth. I did not know this. 17:5. Got some other believers in trouble with the authorities. You know, when Paul would go speak, not everybody received his message well. I'm just saying. Unlike the authorities in Philippi, the Thessalonican authorities take bail and then let him go. And I think they probably took bail saying, look, Jason, you get rid of Paul and his company, and I'll give you your money back. That's what it looks like took place there. So, in the next verse, Paul and Silas sneak out of town under darkness of night. Can you see the advertisement in the paper for looking for apostle to go into Jewish synagogues to share the messiahship of Yeshua? Will involve risks, no pay. Please call this number. I'm just saying. There's going to be a whole lot more of these passages where people are in the synagogue, Paul or somebody goes in and shares, and if Dr. Chilton is correct, along with every other major Christian commentator in the world, and I looked at commentaries from the 1800s, they all agree, they can't go back ever again, or they'll be idol worshipers. Moving forward. When we pick up here next time, we'll start with some statements that Paul said that, as I read them, seem to contradict what Dr. Chilton said. His conclusions, as they impact missionary activity in Acts. And, I say, do not fear. We will look to address the question that everyone here has on their mind, and that is, was Paul an undiagnosed schizophrenic? Inquiring minds want to know. That's all I got. Thank you.